Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about the biography on Neal Cassady titled Neal Cassady, The Fast Life of a Beat Hero. So this is the second Neal Cassady biography I'm doing a review on. The last book that I reviewed was The Holy Goof, a biography of Neal Cassady. And that book, like I said, is very focused on the myth of Neal Cassady. It's very focused on Dean Moriarty from On the Road. It's focused on that character that Neal Cassady became. But this book begins by addressing all of the myths about Neal Cassady. It addresses the fact that he was not actually born on the side of the road in Salt Lake City. So it begins by addressing all these myths that everyone knows about him and just kind of setting the record straight from the very beginning. And it's also, I think, very important to recognize these myths. Even though these myths aren't true, it's very important to address that they exist because Neal Cassady was defined by those myths. Those things that people believe about him kind of defined who he was for most of his life. So I like the way this book describes it. It just kind of describes it as throughout his life, he was chasing his shadow. He spent his life chasing this myth of who he was and trying to become that myth. So it's very important to recognize these myths, even though they're not actually true. But this book does a very good job going into his family background, not just his immediate family, but his grandparents and ancestors. Because his book, The First Third, talks about a lot of these ancestors that he has that first came to the United States. So this book goes into all of that. And by looking at his relatives and all of his ancestors, you really get a good sense of what life was like during the American West in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was very much still the Wild West at that point. So his parents and grandparents really grew up in the Wild West. And that definitely had a big impact on Neal Cassady during his early life. And he was born during the 1920s, lived during the 1930s out west. So it was still very much Wild West at that point too. So he really grew up in this old America that doesn't really exist anymore. And when this book talks about his family's background, it draws a lot from his only published work, The First Third. But as it draws from The First Third, it addresses a lot of the information that's not correct, a lot of the myths that are in that book. So it's constantly addressing things that aren't true as it draws from a lot of Neal Cassady's work. And I also like just reading about his life during the 1930s. He kind of bounced around between living with his mother, living with his father. But when he lived with his father, he kind of lived this classic hobo life that you think of during the Great Depression. Just kind of traveling around looking for work, hopping trains around the country. He really lived this stereotypical life that you think of someone who lived during the Great Depression. So you see how this very chaotic childhood really shaped him the rest of his life. And it talks about how when he was a child or a teenager, he used to steal cars, how he stole 500 cars in Denver before he was even old enough to drive a car. So you see that he had this very reckless life that he just looked for an adrenaline rush in life. And that probably came from this childhood of hopping trains with his father. And he continued to travel during his teen years. He would travel back and forth between California and Colorado and just all around the American West. So he just spent this childhood and early adulthood constantly traveling around the United States. And this book also talks about Justin Brierley, who's kind of a mentor to Neal Cassady. As Neal Cassady was in and out of reform school, this educator, Justin Brierley, really helped to guide Neal on the correct path in life. So it really talks about his impact on Neal as he grew up. But this book just gives a very just fleshed out story of his youth. Unlike the other biography, The Holy Goof, which kind of just glosses over his childhood, this goes very in depth about his childhood. I would say the first a big chunk of this book is about his childhood. So after this book gives a solid overview of his childhood and teen years, it gives a pretty solid description of the Beat generation as it was developing in New York City and describes this whole scene that Neal Cassady found himself in when he went to New York with his first wife, Luann. And I feel like when you usually read about Neal Cassady and the Beat generation, you read about how when Neal Cassady went to New York, he immediately connected with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. But this book gives an analysis of it. It kind of describes how when he first went there, none of them liked him. None of them thought that Neal Cassady was a very good person. They thought he was just a con man who was trying to take advantage of him. So it wasn't this immediate connection that he had. It was a couple interactions where he slowly got to know Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and developed a friendship. But it wasn't an immediate thing like you read about in other descriptions of this meeting. We definitely see how Neal Cassady felt this need to fit in. He really wanted to fit in this intellectual community around Columbia University. He really wanted to be someone like Jack Kerouac. But you see throughout his life, he constantly just collected friends and lovers and just people who he wanted to try to get something out of them, wanted to try to get some experience or some information from them. And that's kind of the way he looked at women. He just, throughout his life, he just constantly was moving between wives and girlfriends and lovers, and each one he tended to go back to again and again and again, but he just kind of collected women that served different purposes for him. Like when he was married to Carolyn Cassady, she kind of represented this family home life for Neal, and as he traveled around, went to different lovers, went to different wives for short periods of time, he always had this family life with Carolyn Cassady he could go back to, and he tended to go back to that throughout his life. And then he had lovers that he could go on adventures with and people he could just have fun with, and he's just constantly just bouncing around between different people and collecting lovers and friends. And as I read this book, I'm starting to get the vibe that with people like Neal Cassady and people in the Beat Generation, they're very much people who seek consumerism. Even though the Beat Generation is thought of as being separate from this consumeristic 1950s, they're very much people who seek adventure and girls and drugs and kicks, and just they're constantly looking to consume adventure and experiences. And the ability to travel around America very freely during the 1950s, the opening up of all these new highways, really fueled their adventures. So their lives are very much influenced by consumerism. Even though the Beat Generation is traditionally thought of as being outside of the consumerism of the 1950s, they're very much a part of it. They're just seeking different things. But the bulk of this book focuses on Neal Cassady's family life in the 1950s after the events depicted on the road. It really focuses on when he lived with Carolyn and just how he tried to create a normal life for himself, even though he was constantly having lovers and affairs on the side and going on adventures and just treating his wife very, very poorly. He really tried to have some kind of traditional life during the 1950s. It talks about how him and his wife developed this interest in Edgar Cayce, how they developed this interest in reincarnation, and just all these very mystic religious ideas. And this very open marriage that Neal Cassady had with his wife, he was always jumping around between different lovers, and Carolyn was always very aware of that, but it wasn't something that was very traditional in the 1950s. It wasn't very normal for these kind of things to happen. This became much more common in the 1960s when the hippie movement took off, but during the 1950s, it's very unusual for people to have these open marriages and just these very open relationships. And Neal Cassady's life is very representative of this change that was starting to happen in the 1950s that finally became much more commonplace in the 60s and 70s. And this book also makes very clear that Neal Cassady was very much the center of the Beat Generation. He was really the center of all these writers, because Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, they all went to California to be with Neal, to be part of his life. And you really see how the beat scene was really shifting from New York to San Francisco during the 1950s. All these writers were really flocking to San Francisco to be a part of this scene that was developing around Neal Cassady. I think the one event that really marked a change in Neal Cassady's life was when he was arrested for selling marijuana to two undercover agents. And he was targeted because he became well known as being this character, Dean Moriarty, in Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So he was pretty much targeted for that. And he went to jail for a little over 2 years for that arrest. But this arrest, him going to jail, really was a defining moment in his life. And this book talks about when he was in jail, he really got to exercise his mind and wasn't really distracted by a lot of kicks and adventure in life. And he really did a lot of reading and learning and just really exercised his mind when he was in jail. And there's a book called Grace Beats Karma, which is about his letters from jail, which I'm going to be reading very shortly. So I'm very looking forward to reading that, reading about a lot of his correspondence with people, just discussing all of the intellectual things he was learning about when he was in jail. So looking forward to reading about that. But after he got out of jail, his life really started to fall apart because he lost his job on the railroad and his wife divorced him. But there was a short period of time where he was really splitting his time between his family and this developing scene in San Francisco, which is known as the Perry Lane scene. It was just a lot of bohemian people who were kind of collecting around San Francisco. And he had this girlfriend, Anne Murphy, who was a very central force in drawing him to this scene. But you see how he was starting to shift into this new lifestyle after he got out of jail and was becoming a much more prominent person in developing counterculture in San Francisco. I really like how this book described the events that were depicted in Jack Kerouac's book Big Sur, because the book Big Sur really represents the end of Neal Cassady's friendship with Jack Kerouac and just the end of this Beat Generation movement that was happening within the area around San Francisco as far as Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac were concerned. And you see this shift slowly starting to happen where Neal Cassady and Jack Kerouac were drifting apart. Neal Cassady was drifting away from his family and becoming much more involved with all these counterculture figures in San Francisco. So you really see how Big Sur the events in that kind of represent the end of the Beat Generation and the start of traditional 1960s counterculture. And this book really describes how Ken Kesey was really the central person in this shift from the Perry Lane bohemian group of people to the Merry Band of Pranksters, which are these group of people that kind of surrounded Ken Kesey and became these really the first hippies in this developing hippie movement. And very quickly, Neal Cassady became the muse of this scene, the muse of these Merry Band of Pranksters. Just the way that he talked and moved, he just really represented this life that they were trying to embody. And very quickly, Neal Cassady became very close to Ken Kesey, and he was the driver of his bus further when he drove across the country to New York. That's all depicted in the book The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So Neal Cassady very quickly became a central person in the Merry Band of Pranksters. And I like how this book described the moment in Ken Kesey's bus trip where they all got to New York, and Ken Kesey and Neal Cassady, they met Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac at this party in New York. And this really should have been this really defining moment in the Beat Generation and the early hippie movement, but it was really this anticlimactic event where the pranksters showed up and they were just partying and being weird and goofy, and they just kind of didn't really respect Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac just really wanted to have nothing to do with Merry Band of Pranksters, and what should have been this great moment where Ken Kesey met Jack Kerouac and the Beats became the hippies, but it really wasn't that. It really was just this dividing line that separated two distinct groups of people. And even though this book does a really good job addressing all the inconsistencies in the story of Neal Cassady, addressing all the myths about Neal Cassady, this book gets one event incorrect. During this bus trip to New York on the bus further, when the Merry Band of Pranksters met Timothy Leary at his estate that he was living at in New York doing all of his experiments, this book describes how when they got there, Timothy Leary wanted nothing to do with the pranksters and he just stayed inside, didn't even come out to see them. And the book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, also explains that. And that's where this book gets its story from. It gets its story from The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And that book really describes how Timothy Leary wanted nothing to do with him, just like Jack Kerouac wanted nothing to do with them. But Timothy Leary actually did come out to meet Ken Kesey and Neal Cassady during that visit. There's a picture that exists. You can find it online. There's a picture of Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, and Neal Cassady all sitting on the bus together at this Millbrook estate where they were at. So they did actually meet each other. It's a myth that they didn't meet each other, but they definitely did represent two distinct scenes in this developing culture of psychedelic drugs. Ken Kesey was this fun adventure person just looking for new experiences, and Timothy Leary was this very scientific person who really studied the effects of LSD on a very scientific level. So definitely was this divide between the two groups, but they didn't actually meet each other. Ken Kesey did meet Timothy Leary during this visit, but this book doesn't talk about that. And a lot of places you'll read don't cover that correctly, but I'm just addressing what is incorrect in this book. But in the years following this bus trip, Ken Kesey had these parties known as the acid tests at his home in La Honda in California. And during these parties, Neal Cassady was kind of the muse or kind of the clown of these events. He kind of just walked around and acted goofy as they played music and they all did LSD, and he just kind of became a central person at all these acid tests. But eventually the acid tests came to an end, and then there was this big commercialized acid test that wasn't based on Ken Kesey's Merry Band of Pranksters. Someone just tried to take advantage of this acid test entering popular culture and did their own commercialized version. And Neal Cassady shows up at this event, and none of the original pranksters are there. It's just this very commercialized fake event. It talks about how Neal Cassady just did not fit in. He's just this really normal looking guy who didn't look like a hippie, but he was the central person in developing this culture, but no one really knew who he was there. He was just this random guy who showed up. And that kind of demonstrates how things were starting to change, and this counterculture is really starting to develop, and Neal Cassady was starting to get left behind. And this book talks about how when Neal Cassady was involved with the Merry Band of Pranksters, he looked both 28 and 58 at the same time. He had this very athletic body, very lean, just full of movement. He just moved like a very young person. But if you look at his face was just very old. He just looked very aged and just falling apart from drug use. And he just wasn't this young person anymore, even though he moved and talked like a young person. But you really see how he was starting to just burn himself out. He was slowly starting to kill himself. And around this time, Tom Wolfe started publishing articles about Ken Kesey, the Merry Band of Pranksters, publishing stories that eventually became the electrochoid acid test. And Neal Cassady started to become pretty well known during this time period. People started to know who he was. And he definitely could have turned this new celebrity status he was slowly starting to develop into something new. He could have turned that into a career where he could have made money. But at this point, he was really starting to just fall apart. He wasn't going to have it in him to become this great author, become this well-known person who was as well known as Ken Kesey. His life was just spiraling out of control. He just wasn't going anywhere with his life at this point. But like I said before, counterculture is really starting to change at this point. There was a new era starting to unfold, and Ken Kesey and Merry Band of Pranksters really weren't a part of that anymore. So by 1967, Ken Kesey moved to Eugene, Oregon on his farm, where he just started to fade away from counterculture and just really did his own thing at his farm all alone in Oregon. So this book is a pretty good analysis of the end of Neal Cassady's life. It really describes how he was starting to burn himself out. And you see how Neal Cassady, he really didn't leave behind very much. He really didn't leave behind any complete art that represented his life. I mean, he had the incomplete biography, the first third, but it wasn't completed. He really didn't have any complete art that represented him. But that really gets at something very important about Neal Cassady. The way that he lived was like a novel, and he became the art. So it's very reflective of his life to have nothing that he left behind, finished, complete as far as art goes. But his life's art is his life itself. At the very end of this book, it really brings his life story full circle, because it talks about how he died by the side of the railroad tracks in Mexico. It talks about how there's so much myth in his death. No one really knows how he died. It's not known if it was from mixing drugs or alcohol or just exposure, or if he just had a heart attack or just collapsed. We don't know what happened to him. He just died by the side of the railroad tracks in Mexico. And there's so much myth in that. And his life begins with myth, because there's so much myth in the story of his birth, the myth of him being born on the road. So his life begins and ends in myths and legends and not really knowing what actually happened to him. And I always find interesting how when he grew up with his father traveling around, he lived with this poor hobo who had nothing, just kind of obscure. And he died the very same way. He lived this very colorful life where he did so many things, met so many people, was such a central person in the development of counterculture in the United States, but he just died this obscure person on the side of railroad tracks in Mexico. So it's just very interesting to read about. He's definitely a very interesting person. And like I said before in other videos I did, he's not a nice person at his core. He's not a nice person at all. He's very interesting to read about, but he's not a nice person. But he definitely had a very important impact on counterculture, and you really have to understand him if you want to understand the 60s. And this book does a very good job doing that. It covers his early life, it covers his later life very well. It addresses all the myths about him. It gets that one thing wrong about him meeting Timothy Leary, but that's not that important. But as far as his life goes, it really covers it very well. It addresses everything. It really tells a full picture of his life. If you're going to read one biography on Neal Cassady, this is the biography to read. The Holy Goof is a good book. It's just more focused on the myth of him, not so much focused on the truth of him. But this book is very focused on the real Neal Cassady. It addresses all the myths and kind of puts everything in perspective, and just does a really good job covering his life. So definitely a book that I would recommend. So yeah, that's Neal Cassady, The Fast Life of a Beat Hero. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.